has developed a strong and robust plebiscitarian regime. Plebiscitarian, Bonapartist, Caesarist, these are all terms used in political theory to describe this type of political systems. Well, if we look at the most well-known instances of plebiscitarian regimes, I think we have to go back to two historically important cases: France, the Second Empire under Napoleon III, and then, of course, the Weimar Republic. France is actually particularly interesting because it was the first plebiscitarian regime that emerged in the 19th century, precisely when the universal suffrage took hold in Europe. And if we look at the type of regime built by Napoleon III in France, he himself characterized it as a combination of monarchy and popular sovereignty, or quote, of democratic equality and hierarchical order, unquote. So he himself was a major theorist of this sort of regime. Now, there were two preconditions basically for it to be installed in France. First was, of course, the radical extension of franchise in 1848. And radical is the key word here, because only a small portion of the French population was allowed to vote before. And after the revolution of 1848, there was already immediately universal male suffrage. And later again, Napoleon III was defending the universal suffrage against those who attempted to limit it. Now, the second very important precondition was, of course, the feeling of resentment after a historical defeat in Napoleonian wars. And the place that Napoleon III was pretending to take in French history was very much motivated by his willingness to take a strong revenge after those historical losses of France. Now we know that, of course, Napoleon III ruled with those elections and plebiscite that gave him a sort of democratic legitimacy, so made him rely directly on the will of the people and towering over the whole political system that was effectively turned into an administrative apparatus. The second important example is, of course, Germany. Germany in the interwar period, because it has actually very similar preconditions. After the loss in the World War, the Great War, first the universal suffrage became inevitable. It was immediately introduced, once again radically extending the number of people who were entitled to take part in the process. And then clearly there was a major military defeat that was traumatic, really traumatic for the Germans. And this is where we also get important theories of plebiscitarian democracy endorsed by people like Max Weber or Carl Schmitt, or a little bit later by Josef Schumpeter. They were all relying on the idea that mass democracy is both inevitable under current conditions and dangerous. So therefore, it has to be used to empower a strong leader. Weber called him a dictator from the electoral battlefield, and took directly the inspirations from the regime of Louis Bonaparte. So that's a kind of synthetic regime, pretty much robust and consciously designed to be robust. Now we look at Russia. We will also find there similar preconditions for development of the political system. Once again, we have a sudden introduction of universal suffrage after all those many years of virtually non-existent Soviet elections. Suddenly, the population felt that it has a part to play in in Russian politics. And after initial optimism about that, it was very quickly replaced by a lot of skepticism, disenchantment, and alienation from the legal system. And then, of course, there was this the same resentment after historical defeat, this time in the Cold War. And even though it was only partial in the 1990s, it was extremely strengthened and aggravated by Vladimir Putin in the 90s. So that actually now there is a very, very deep feeling of resentment and revanchism among the Russians. Now, why is that important? Because it actually shows us how those regimes are capable of working. They reproduce democratic legitimacy of the leader through permanent plebiscitary procedures, such as elections, plebiscites, opinion polls, and this is how the leader towers above the system, claiming the legitimacy of his rule over the bureaucracy, over the elites, and over the masses themselves.
So, excuse me,
course,
may I just ask you to please wrap up in about 1 minute to keep the time?
So I'm actually close to finalizing that, because what I'm willing to say is that in this plebiscitarian regime, we can very well see the sources of it being so aggressive. It first reframes all internal divisions into external. It suppresses all kinds of internal opposition, and therefore sees itself as constantly threatened from the outside. For that reason, it systematically overstates the external danger, overemphasizes the external danger, and is prone to military aggression and military adventures. Then this enables some sort of reactive imperialism, or so to say, defensive imperialism, where the leadership is constantly feeling threatened by the external forces and in need to expand in order to prevent from being taken down. And finally, it also nurtures the constant need for an acclamation, for creating a public support for the political leadership. And before it has to generate those pretexts for this sort of universal acclamation to the leader. So that is basically how these type of regimes, like once we know in France, Second Empire, in Germany, interwar period, and in present-day Russia, this is why all of them end up in a military aggression, and all of them end up in a terrible military venture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for an interesting presentation. So I'll introduce the second speaker today, and this is Alla Korzeniak. You are a journalist and the anchor woman of New Day from Kiev. And your topic is the work of a journalist in the war, or why I stay in Ukraine. Please, very welcome. I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much for having me on this roundtable. What I wanted to say first, that I cannot spend with you all the 3 hours. So if you have questions, it is better to ask me now, because on the one hand, we have airstrike alarm already now. It is like from 5 to 10 times per day. So maybe I will need to go to some shelter. Now I am at our studio, at our office in Kiev, and also I have my live broadcasting in 2 hours. That's why I cannot spend all the time with you. But again, thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to share my experience. Actually, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scientist, so I can talk only about what I see, what I hear, what I'm thinking about. the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine. And the first thing I wanted to underline, which is very important for Ukrainian journalists and also for all Ukrainian people, that a lot of media, international media, Western, not only Western actually, are still calling what's happening in Ukraine like crisis or conflict. What I want to underline that it is not a crisis or conflict, it is a full-scale war which is happening every day in my country. That's why the definitions are very important for us. So I hope you can spread this this point of view. Also, what I can say, my topic is like why I am staying in Ukraine, why I'm still working as a journalist, because we need to tell to people in Ukraine and outside Ukraine what's really happening, what we see on our own eyes. For example, I started this morning with a small trip to the other district in Kiev, where the shelling was this morning. I saw the results of this, how they call in Russia, denazification of Ukraine. So I saw three destroyed buildings and one cafe, which actually it was damaged, but people reopen it and still selling coffee because they need to continue their work, to have some money and to continue like some kind of normal life. So that's the reality we are living in for this 28 days. Yes, that's actually the 28th day of the full-scale war. But what I also wanted to say and to remind you that this war hasn't started 28 days ago. Actually, we have this war for 8 years. It started with the annexion of Crimea and with the battles on the eastern regions of Ukraine in Donetsk and Luhansk region. And we had this war all these 8 years, and we realized that it is happening all the time, and we had civilians dead and wounded. But now it was a shock even for me. I worked with the international media from 2014, so I know the situation. But even for me, it was shock that like rockets from the territory of even not Russia, from Belarus, are falling on my native city. So why I decided to stay in Kiev? Because I'm trying to do my best to inform people all around the world about this war, not to let the world to forget about what's going on in Ukraine. Every day I have several requests from the journalists from New Zealand, Australia, India, some Arabic countries, Poland, Romania, United States, Great Britain, and France, and so on, to have some interview or to share some contacts or to meet the journalists who are in Kiev and to help them to figure out what's going on the ground. And also we have live broadcasting from the first day of the full-scale war. On our radio, we have like a national broadcasting. So I know that some people in other cities in Ukraine who doesn't have light internet connection mobile phone connections, still have the radio. So in several cities, we are like the only connection to the other world. So that's why I think my job here is important, and that's why I decided to stay in Kyiv as long as it possible. So if you have questions, I'm ready to answer, because as I said before, I will need to go to do my live broadcasting and maybe to the shelter because of air raid alarm.
Thank you very much. You didn't use your 10 minutes. Should we, well, we have a third speaker, but are you able to listen to the third speaker, or would you like your questions right now? I mean, it's possible.
If it is possible to answer the questions now, I prefer, and I will ask you to do it now, because actually we are not very good here now in Ukraine in like long-term planning. So if we have the opportunity to talk, we talk. If we have the opportunity to drink water or to sleep, we do it like right now. And because you never know what will happen, even sometimes in 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, so I wonder, are there any questions in the Q&A already for Alla? I see some questions here, but okay.
If you have them in the chat.
Okay, there is one question here. Thank you so much for your bravery in remaining so that the rest of the world can learn about what is happening in Ukraine right now. I'm not sure how to word this question, but I'm wondering if you have been able to feel solidarity from any Belarusian colleagues at present. Have you heard anything about how this war is being perceived in Belarus?
Actually, yesterday I had the interview with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is the leader of the Belarusian opposition, and we were talking about you should divide Belarusian people who are against regime and Lukashenko's regime and the supporters, because there are a lot of people from Belarus who are not living in Belarus anymore, and now they are supporting Ukraine very much. They give some humanitarian aid. Also, I know that some people inside Belarus now are trying to protest. They make some hacker attacks to Belarusian websites to cut the logistics of the military supplies.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other question? Yes, there is. Ukrainians are heroic nation. Belarusians support, well, it's being written while I'm speaking here. Belarusians support our fraternal Ukrainian people, but that's not really a question. It was more like a comment. So the next one is a question. Dear Alla, thank you very much for taking the time. Could you maybe speak more on the topic of civilian participation in territorial defense, please?
Actually, there is. I don't remember the full numbers, but as I know, it is something around 100,000 of people who already joined the territorial defense units in different cities. And if we're talking about Kyiv, I know that the people who want to join, they are still in the line because a lot of people want to do something. So they are just waiting in the line, waiting for the call, for example, and volunteering or helping in other way. So it is a lot of there are a lot of people who want to join the territorial defense unit, but maybe not of them are like needed necessary. And as I have my colleagues from the radio who joined the territorial defense units, and they said before, it's like a privilege now in Kyiv to be part of it, like to be part of this defense. So that's how the situation looks like in Kyiv. About other cities, I think the situation is kind of same, because I've talked to my friends in western regions of Ukraine, and they were also waiting for 2 days to join the territorial defense unit, because the line before them was like for 2 days.
Okay, there is another question here for you. Well, they are appearing rather quickly, from Olivier Reisner. Dear Allah, thank you very much. Yes, is it possible to apply the norms of journalistic non-bias while being under attack? Thanks, and all the best from Tbilisi.
Sorry, once again.
Is it possible to apply the norms of journalistic non-bias while being under attack? That is the question.
It is a big question for me every day. Should I stay like neutral? Should I keep the balance while I'm here in Kyiv, reporting about war which is happening in my country? And I have no answer, no direct answer for you, because sometimes, like as a human, I am angry, I am sad. I have my friends who lost their parents in Mariupol. I have my colleagues who were shot by Russian troops near Kyiv. I have my parents as refugees because they had to run from the small city near Kyiv because it was too dangerous to stay there. So it is sometimes very hard to keep the balance. But what I'm trying to do in my work, I'm trying to check the information, to use several sources as we did it before war, and to use less emotions but more facts in what I am saying on the radio. But I'm not sure that it works like 100% all the time. But I cannot talk about other colleagues. There are different points of view. I can say about me, I'm trying to stay a journalist on the first side, but emotionally, sometimes it is very hard.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another couple of questions because you got many now. One is from Viktor Shadursky. Unfortunately, there are traitors among Ukrainians who serve the invaders. Who are they? How many? Do you have anything about that to say? Sort of.
I have only the official information from the Ukrainian defense service about like several cases. It is not like not a common thing, even in the cities which are now temporarily captured by Russian troops, more people are still like pro-Ukrainian, not pro-Russian, and they even look to Kherson. It's in the south of Ukraine. Kherson, Berdyansk, Kakhovka, Melitopol. They are still having Ukrainian meetings with Ukrainian flags and so on, and sometimes or almost all the time it is dangerous for their lives. So like mostly people are not traitors, but some cases which are already prosecuted, they are. And what I know, it was one case of the man from the Russian church captured in Kiev day before yesterday. Yeah, sometimes it happens, but it's not like a mass event.
Okay, thank you. So there is also a question about what is your opinion on Ukraine negotiating with Russia and end of the war? And then I also have a question myself. I wonder if you have any comment. I've heard about that there are refugees, so-called refugees, coming to Russia. Who are they, and what are, I mean, why and how are they actually coming there?
I will start with the last question because I know a little bit about this situation. There is a huge humanitarian catastrophe in Mariupol, city in the eastern Ukraine, which is like constantly destroyed by Russian aviation. So it is impossible to live there now. There is no light, no water supplies, no food supplies for almost 3 weeks. And there are already cases when people are evacuating, but are trying to run from the city. But Russians are took their buses and they drive to Russian Federation, and there is no connection with these people from Mariupol. So we don't know about their like next days. Where are they? Also, yesterday, a friend of mine was trying to call to the so-called Donetsk People Republic services to find out do they have any lists of people who are like actually I think I can call it a crime. So they just took people and don't ask them if they want to go to Russia or not, but they're taking them there. So he was asking about the lists to find his mother, because Mariupol is a big city divided by river, and the left side of the city it is closer to Russia, and it is almost impossible to cross the river and to go to the Ukrainian bloc posts and the Ukrainian army. That's why some people they just don't have other options than to go to Russia. But I don't know what happens with them after that. And about the negotiations and how they will end. As I said before, our horizon of planning is like very, very short. Every morning when I wake up, I just say thank you that I'm still here and I can talk to people and to continue to do my job. So I cannot say when the war ends. and I think it will last till the last Russian soldier will go away from Ukrainian land. And when I say Ukrainian land, I mean the borders which were from the 1991. So Ukrainian land with this captured regions in the east, in Donetsk and Lugansk region, and also with Ukrainian Crimea. I think that's the only way this war can end. And about the negotiations, people in Ukraine are like watching and reading the news about these negotiations, but as the different sociology shows that the point is we don't want like peace just for peace and do all the Russian Federation will ask us to do. The price is already very high. The price we paid for our freedom is very high. That's why we don't want to talk about about peace on the Russian point of view.
Thank you very much. Actually, we should go on, but let us anyway take the two more questions, and then we will just go a little over the break, I hope. So there is one question about, could you please say something about ethnic and national diversity in Russian armed contingent in Ukraine, or the use of non-Russians, for example, migrants from Central Asian countries or Syrians? That's about one of the questions, and the other one is if you could say something about the situation in Kherson.
Okay, I don't know really a lot about who is fighting in Russian army. I have only the information from people who were in small cities around Kyiv, where the huge fights were and still continuing. They said that there were people from different regions of Russia. So from Buryatia, I think, and from Chechnya. That's the only information I have personally from people who were there in small cities near Kyiv. I cannot talk about Syrians because I don't have this information confirmed. And about Kherson, what I know for now, that the city is temporarily occupied by Russian Federation, but the pro-Ukrainian meetings are still held every day, and we even had several calls from our radio to Kherson to talk with these people who are joining these meetings and who are trying to help people there, like volunteers, and they say that on the one hand the situation is very bad because all the like well-known activists, pro-Ukrainian activists, they are targets for Russians all the time, but on the other hand, there is no huge shelling now, no rocket attacks. That's why the city is functioning, but in a very, very strange, very bad way. And also a good friend of my mother, she's still in Kherson. and she told that they join these meetings, this Ukrainian meetings every day. They have some coordination inside, and they will do it as long as they can, even after shooting and this. I don't know how to explain light sound bombs, what the police use against protesters.
The tear gas.
Sometimes. These meetings become more dangerous, but people will continue go into the central square with Ukrainian flags.
Okay, thank you very much, Alla. Thank you. It was so important for us to get these direct reflections from you, and thank you very much for participating in our roundtable. Good luck, and yes, everybody, of course, think that you are doing a very important job. And
thank you.
Good luck with everything. Thank you very much. So we'll go to our next speaker, who is Manne Wangborg from Sweden. He was the ambassador of Kazakhstan in 2010 to 2014 and Consul-General of Sweden in Kaliningrad in 2006 to 2009, later acting Consul-General on the Åland Islands in the Baltic Sea. And you are going to talk on the topic of today's Putinism and a new incarnation of the former imperial policy of the USSR towards the former Soviet republics. Please go ahead. I give you 10 minutes from now. And very well.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the two introductory remarks. I learned a lot from them. I will begin my presentation by looking backwards. The Soviet dissident writer and historian Andrei Amalrik became famous 50 years ago, half a century ago, for his book, Will the Soviet Union Last Until 1984? Amalrik predicted that the Soviet Union would survive George Orwell's dystopian year 1984. He was proved right. The Soviet Union did survive 1984 and continued to exist beyond 1984. But right at that time, things were really starting to crack, and just a few years later, the formerly monolithic Soviet Union dissolved. But Amalrik had not chosen the title Will the Soviet Union Last Until 1984 if he had not foreseen and hoped that the Soviet Union would one day dissolve. Already on the first page, he makes an autobiographical reflection, which is particularly appropriate at this stage. He tells us that as a historian, he had been busy writing a book on Russia's cradle, Kievskaya Rus, but was forced to interrupt his work. His ensuing credo reads, "Now I hope to be compensated for this miscalculation in my science by witnessing the downfall of this state." Amalrik, however, would not witness the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Well, in fact, he would not even experience the year 1984 either. He died in 1980. What Amalrik did not quite count on was the imminent resurrection of the Soviet Union. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was followed by a brief euphoric phase in the 1990s, closely associated with Boris Yeltsin's presidency, when a dismantling of the communist straitjacket and a transition to a new democratic social order seemed possible. But these sentiments did not succeed. Soon in Russia, massive countervailing forces appeared, forces that would prove stronger overwhelming. Forces that sought to turn back the clock, which in a drastic simplification wanted to effectively restore the Soviet Union. The leader of these forces was eventually Vladimir Putin. When Yeltsin unexpectedly abdicated his position as president of Russia at the turn of the millennium, Putin became acting president. Anointed and handpicked by Yeltsin, the former intelligence officer Putin then had no difficulty to win the ensuing presidential election and to become president-elect. Yeltsin was in his most powerful days a charismatic and very popular president in Russia, but as time went on, faded into a shadow of his old self, and when he unexpectedly resigned the presidency, he was worn out and listless, virtually unable to steer a vast empire. The contrast with Putin could not have been greater. The younger, more powerful and athletic Putin became a dream prince. He exuded health and determination, which the Russian people had longed for during Yeltsin's decline and therefore highly valued. Putin also rode a wave of goodwill and positive expectations in the outside world, in the West, where it was first taken for granted that Putin would pursue the political and economic reform work that Yeltsin had begun during the 1990s. This, however, was not to be. On the contrary, cautiously but decisively, Putin reversed course, made himself increasingly autocratic, and began to steer Russia back in Soviet direction. Putin learned from George Orwell's stark view of history and sharp analysis of society. Quote, "Who rules the past controls the future. Who controls..." In the same vein as Orwell's Ministry of Truth, Putin is not content to steer the present and the future. For to realize his totalitarian claims to power, he also wants to control the past. Like the unscrupulous autocrat he is, Putin spares no means, but lies, falsifies, and distorts as it suits his private and political ends. In the war against Ukraine, Putin has elevated his art of lying, falsifying, and distorting to new heights. Putin's frequently quoted 2005 statement that, quote, "The collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest geopolitical disasters," end quote, is among the most telling signs of conscious programmatic Soviet nostalgia, which characterized by persecution and repression of political opposition, human rights defenders, writers, and dissidents. Stalinism, great power chauvinism, even military violence against neighboring countries, as we are witnessing today. Putin's recent unprecedented admission that the Russian security services will kill its own citizens, that Alexei Navalny would have been killed if they had only wanted him dead, demonstrate that today's political leadership in Russia is the ideological heir to the Stalin dictatorship's lawlessness and terror, repression, persecution, and indiscriminate killing. With his fearless truth-telling, the quick-witted and inventive opposition politician Navalny challenges Putin's unrestrained claim to power and totalitarian falsification of reality. In the first years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union during Yeltsin's 1990s, one could rightly claim that Russia differed from the Soviet Union in one crucial respect. Citizens could freely express their views in speech and in writing without fear of being threatened or subject to violence or being thrown into prison. But the Putin regime's insidious poisoning of dissenting citizens and the brutal hunt for Navalny's associates, and more particularly the current aggression against Ukraine, illustrate how Russia is moving closer and closer to Soviet-style power, pure arbitrariness, complete legal uncertainty, and domestic terror.
Excuse me, I'm interrupting now. Could you please wrap up in about 1 minute, please?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Through various political and legal tricks, Putin has managed to prolong his own rule until 2034. By accident, then 50 years remain until 2084, 100 years after George Orwell's fateful dystopian year 1984. Who will dare to extrapolate for another half century and write another book? Will the Soviet Union last until 2084? Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much. That was interesting. I think I have two questions, one for you and one for the other speaker. So I just go ahead here with one question for Manne. In your opinion, what role do you think the sanctions will play in developing the political regime? Would it be correct to say that the sanctions will intensify the authoritarian trends in it, or vice versa? And I read out the second question as well, and you will have an opportunity to answer, both of you. Why is the term plebiscitarian here preferable to authoritarian in thinking about today's Russia? Also, is there a difference between how suffrage elections work in the Napoleonic France and Weimar Germany, and how works in contemporary Russia? There are distinctions between legitimate, illegitimate, let me see here, democratic, non-democratic elections in these cases. That is the question number 2. So who would like to start? Greg, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess the Bestiary question is addressed to me. I actually find the whole dichotomy between authoritarian and democratic quite unfortunate, precisely because it fails to grasp that the type of regime that we're talking about is sort of a democratic monarchy, as Napoleon III himself has put it. So it's an authoritarian rule that relies on manufacture of popular support. And it's not some sort of hybrid regime, like combining the elements of one another, but a synthetic regime where it deliberately combines the strong centralized power of the monarch with the democratic legitimacy that he gets from the people. So basically, there is no contradiction at all here between those elections, those which are usually thought to be part of democratic setup, and the monarchic rule. So it's a monarchy based on elections. And in that respect, actually, there's a lot of similarities between how it functions in Napoleonic France and current day Russia. I mean, I don't think I have to go here into details, but up to the minute elements of the current day elections in Russia, this is exactly how it functions in Napoleonic France. Where, for instance, there was always an administrative candidate who benefited from establishing a close connection with Napoleon, so basically borrowing some sort of legitimacy from Napoleon, and then the whole apparatus was working on promoting this candidate. So this is exactly how those elections are working in Russia. And I think the point here, the very point of this study of plebiscitarianism, is that this is a robust system that enables a strong monarchical leader to rule, precisely because he's capable of producing this popular support. Well, by producing, I mean that this doesn't necessarily need to be a genuine support. It's rather some sort of like passive non-intervention coming from below, and that, I think, partly explains the attitude of the Russians towards this invasion now, and the Russians are mostly staying quite distant from it, passively accepting it without enthusiasm and trying to distance themselves from what is going on, to disregard it, to deny it, and well, actually become negligent about that.
Okay, thank you very much. And Manne, I have one more question for you, Greg, after Manne has been able to answer. Yes, please.
Well, there is plenty of academic research showing that sanctions seldom work. I think it stands to reason that it's very difficult to organize sanctions and make them effective. But it would seem that this time, even though Russia would be the most difficult of all to sanction, just because of its great degree of independence, its enormous resources, natural resources, but it's also very dependent on Western technology, and it seems that the sanctions that are currently in place are beginning to bite, and that an increasing number of Russian citizens are feeling that, are noticing that, are realizing that Russia is actually now on the verge of becoming an international outcast. This is a very, very unpleasant thought for an old cultural country such as Russia. Very, very uncomfortable. So, and of course, I mean, at this stage, there's no choice. There's no going back. There's no possibility for the West to revoke the current sanctions. They have to be maintained, and they have to become even more biting.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I think we don't have time for the second question. We might have time later on, but let's thank the panelists, and it was very, very important contributions, and thank you very much. So I leave the word now to Edward again. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Sätre. Thank you to the three panelists. Now we're going to shift attention to the broader region. We're going to have three speakers who are going to speak about China and China's reaction to the invasion of Ukraine. We're going to speak about the effects in Central Asia, a region that is also feeling the effects of sanctions and the effects of Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. And we're going to talk about US interests in the region. And so we have three fantastic panelists to take us through these different issues. Before saying that, I want to say that this event, this roundtable, is being organized as part of a project that I am involved with Professor Bo Pettersson from Malmö University, Elena Podelian from Södertörn University, and Oleg Antonov, also from Malmö University, and it focuses on policy transfer diffusion within the post-communist space, and it's funded by the Center for Baltic and East European Studies. So without further ado, we will turn to the first panelist on this, our second panel, and we will hear first from Marina Svensson, who is Professor of Modern China Studies and Director of the Center for East and Southeast Asian Studies at Lund University, who will talk about China's reaction to the invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Edward, and thank you all to the panelists and the organizer for inviting me. China's close relations with Russia and President Vladimir Putin's visit to China during the Olympics, which resulted in a no limits joint statement in the very run up to the invasion of Ukraine, has tied China and also probably Xi Jinping personally to the war, whether he or China wants it or not. And as you probably all know, there have been speculations on whether China knew about the planned invasion or its scale and gave its blessing, thinking it a limited and quick affair like in 2014 that wouldn't provoke big reactions from the West. Regardless of this was the case, and this is of course pure speculations, it's safe to assume that the scale of the invasion and widespread destruction and humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and China's refusal to condemn the invasion and even to call it an invasion and a war has put China's role and relations with Russia in the spotlight. I think China is certainly worried, probably also very surprised about the unfolding events. The fact that the Russian invasion hasn't gone so smoothly or quickly, the strength of the Ukraine resistance, and also the show of unity from the West and the large-scale sanctions. And they are certainly thinking about the economic and geopolitical implications and consequences for itself as the war continues. It's worth remembering, and I don't have time to go into details here, that the Sino-Russian relations haven't been always very cozy, and they haven't always been close friends and partners, strategic partners, as they call themselves now, in the past. And we all know about the split, the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s. We also know about the fear in China, the fear within the Communist Party after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the communists in East Europe, and China's concerns, of course, about the various color revolutions. But jumping then quickly to the rise of power of Xi Jinping after 2013, we have seen increasing and good relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. They have met many times, and in fact, Vladimir Putin is the foreign leader that Xi Jinping has met with the most. And there's been increasing economic ties then also after the war in 2014. So it's obvious that China and Russia currently share some interest and values when it comes to geopolitical issues, security issue. They both stress the importance of sovereignty, and they also united, of course, in counteracting American influence. They also, of course, share an authoritarian political system where, even though there are ideological differences between the two leaders, and where the two leaders also are similar in the sense that they have also centralized power to themselves. And China and Russia also have similarities when it comes to control over the media and the internet, and it has been more so in China in the past, but increasingly in Russia today. It's also important to remember then that there are differences in their relations. There is an imbalance. China's economy is by far the more stronger, and China is more incorporated in with Western economies than Russia. And China is also spending more on the military than Russia is doing. China is importing natural resources and military technology from Russia, and it's itself investing in infrastructure and exporting consumption goods to Russia. So coming back then to the Russian invasion in Ukraine and China's reactions. So the statement that the two leaders announced when Putin visited Beijing in February was a statement of partnership that had no limits, whatever that means. They also denounced the NATO enlargement, where they have similar opinions. And they also said that they wanted to establish a new global order with true democracy. China is today attempting a balancing act, and not very convincingly, at least to people outside of China, presenting itself as neutral and upholding respect of sovereignty, which is one of its major statements always in foreign affairs. They have not condemned the war, and they are also actually avoiding the word war and invasion and using the Russian wordings of a special military operation. And China also abstained from, rather than oppose, the UN Security Council resolution condemning the invasion. There have Xi Jinping and Putin talked after the war, but the day after the war began, but they haven't reportedly talked since then, which is interesting in itself, perhaps. And Xi Jinping has, of course, not talked with the Ukraine president either. There have been other talks between, in particular, then Chinese foreign officials and American foreign officials. And there have been statements from the Chinese Foreign Ministry deploring the outbreak of the conflict, to talk about the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and arguing the parties to find a solution through negotiations. President Biden and President Xi Jinping met last Friday, and what has come out from these talks is also a call for a ceasefire and followed by humanitarian aid. But on the other hand, China has, and also in its media, and I will come back to that, also disseminated false news. For example, the news that Zelensky had left Ukraine, also about the presence or alleged presence of US biological weapons in Ukraine. And they have allowed Russian media to spread disinformation in the Chinese media. So I want to focus a little bit on the role of media and social media in this war, and the existence of what you will call, well, what is disinformation and information bubbles also in both Russia and China. In China, of course, there's problems to discuss openly sensitive foreign policy issues. There have been few scholars who have been open about different views from the Chinese leadership. The Chinese media also has to follow the official line of foreign policy. And there have also been propaganda directives against reporting disadvantage to Russia or sympathetic to the West or Ukraine. And there have also been in the past several agreements between Russian and Chinese state media, and Russian media is also present on the Chinese internet. So there's a lot of pro-Russian disinformation circulated on the media, and also in the view in the Chinese media is that the war is to be blamed on NATO and its aggressive expansion, and that's so that the US and NATO and Ukraine itself is to blame for the war, not Russia. There are some more nuanced reporting on the humanitarian crisis by some more independent media. When it comes to the online environment, of course, there's censorship in China, but censorship is very selective in China, so there's no problems with criticizing the US or the West or posting positive things about Putin, who is very much seen by a lot of people in China as a strongman. Whereas pro-Ukraine views have been censored and deleted. Still, I've seen some more critical reports on Chinese social media. There have been circulations of, for example, the Russian journalists who protest of the war on Russian state TV. There have been circulation or translations also about, for example, Russian authors criticizing the war. And there have also been translations and videos from Western media that quickly appear on Chinese social media. And there's also been interesting reports from Chinese citizens based in Ukraine, and one of them also trying to provide a more nuanced picture and also about the violence in Ukraine that has been shared and viewed, although sometimes his videos are also censored in China. So what we are seeing, and which is very dangerous, of course, is this polarized views and the skewed information on both Russian and Chinese media. And also there is this difference between the younger educated people in China and Russia who have access to Western media and social media, and then thus are more generally supportive of Ukraine and critical of Russia, whereas older generations in China, like in Russia, probably are more believe in and are more looking at the state media and get that picture, and are more strengthened in their anti-US views.
1 minute.
Yeah, so the dilemma for China then, and wrapping up here quickly, is that China cannot completely distance itself from or criticize Russia because they're too deep in this partnership. But on the other hand, they don't want to alienate the West completely. So it's very pragmatic, and it's taking a wait and see attitude. China certainly doesn't want to defeat a weakened and isolated Russia, or a Russia without Putin, and which would also have implications for Xi Jinping himself and his own power base, probably. When it comes to how far China would go in actually supporting I don't think there will be any military support, maybe economic support of some kinds, like after or closer ties. And of course, China's actions depend on the future developments of how the war turns out. The other issue that has been raised is, of course, the issue if China can rise to the challenge of being a responsible major power and mediate. There's no signs as yet, and other countries have stepped in more actively. And this, of course, undermines maybe China's role and impact also on the developments of the war. My final word then, that it's difficult to predict, of course, the long-term policy from China's side or the consequences, but we do see a more polarized world. And also we see this very dangerous information gap and perception gap between China, Russia on the one side and Western countries, which also then underlines the importance of good journalism, like we heard just in the previous panel, and the importance to fight disinformation and be critical when we read social media. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for that interesting presentation on China's perspective. Now we're going to shift gears and move to another great power within the system, to the United States. And we're going to hear from George Kroll, who was US ambassador in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, and in Uzbekistan, and is now an adjunct faculty member at the Naval War College, as well as an associate at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Affairs. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Edward, and the other panelists. Just to look at context first, Russia has long been opposed to US policy and presence and activities in the former Soviet republics. It's quote unquote near abroad and its sphere of privileged interests, and has long seen the United States as actively trying to pull these states away from Russia and toward the US and Western sphere, thereby threatening Russian security and Russia's identity and its mission as a unifier and protector of the Russian world, the Ruski Mir. And by the same token, the United States has long refused to recognize a Russian sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union by supporting verbally the independence of republics. And they wouldn't say so directly, but it was clear it was independence from Russian domination. And the United States had policies of economic and political and social policies to diversify the ties of these countries beyond Russia, and to some extent from the Russian perspective, away from Russia. And Russia has long viewed the former Soviet republics, especially their fellow Slavic states, if you will, of Ukraine and Belarus, as utterly vital to Russia's security interests and its own security and its vision of maintaining and protecting the Russian world as it was seen. And the Russian statements and Russian efforts over the years, long before Putin, I would say, have made this quite clear. At the same time, the United States has never really considered the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, as vital to US national interests, not really as part of the Western world as conceived in the United States, maybe even in Europe as well, and also as being internally unstable. And as we could see in the US and Western response to Russia's earlier actions to assert its influence by force in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine in 2014, even its involvement in Nagorno-Karabakh, and also its involvement in Kyrgyzstan without the use of force, that it really reflected a de facto acceptance of a Russian sphere of influence in this region, sanctions and condemnations on Russia notwithstanding. Now, the big question is does or will the Russian invasion of Ukraine force a change in US policy and approach in the former Soviet republics? As we see in Ukraine, it seems to be, well, there's a ramping up from the United States of military support, diplomatic support, economic support, but up to a point that overall, while the United States has ramped all of this up, still, it doesn't seem that the United States is willing to confront Russia head on, or even to make this area of the world, including perhaps Ukraine, on the highest priority of the American foreign policy agenda. Nevertheless, there is in the United States, in the public view and even in the Congress, a growing push to put Ukraine in particular as a much higher level of security interest of the United States, to see what Russia's war against Ukraine is a war against the United States. And therefore, the United States should view it as such, and therefore make this a high priority. Now, this may be so with Ukraine, but if we're talking about the other parts of the former Soviet world, that may be another story. But at this particular point, it doesn't seem that the American political administration wishes to put Ukraine and the rest of the former Soviet world into a higher level of priority in American foreign policy. I mean, the United States will encourage these states not to support Russia, but short of condemning Russia, and I mean the states other than Ukraine. They don't want to expand this conflict between Ukraine and Russia into the other parts of the former Soviet Union or the Soviet world. Russia's preoccupied with Ukraine, and probably, although they're putting pressure on these republics to support them, how hard will that pressure be? And similarly, the United States is absorbed with Ukraine. And so therefore, how far will the United States go in pushing these republics to not support Russia and to pull back from its support? Now, I would expect that, as we see, the United States is isolating, for instance, Belarus, the government of Belarus, as if it were a part of Russia, and they will probably continue to support verbally the opposition in Vilnius and Poland. I expect the United States will give Moldova more attention and support as a quote unquote frontline European state that could come under Russian aggression. But what does that really mean, to give more attention and support, if at the bottom line is there is no desire or to make a direct confrontation with Russia? And I think that the United States would also want to become avoiding being enmeshed in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia really isn't in the US mindset. In Central Asia, I think Uzbekistan will likely garner greater US attention, as it has been more publicly resistant to Russian influence in the aftermath of the invasion. But I think relations with Kazakhstan may be less close as a result of a perceived in Washington closeness, greater closeness of Kazakhstan to Russia, and in Kyrgyzstan too. I think also US businesses will avoid the former Soviet area as too risky concerning sanctions on Russia and just the overall sense of potential instability in this whole region. Now, the republics themselves are observing how the situation in Ukraine unfolds. They don't want to be pulled into a conflict or forced by either Russia or the United States to take sides. And I think there's a certain fear of getting too close to the United States, as there would be getting too close to Russia, because of the economic ramifications of being too close to Russia now under such sanctions, but also the concern of coming under greater pressure from Russia by getting too close to the United States. So I think that there is also little US leverage in these republics, particularly I would say in Central Asia after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, which has to be factored in. There's also an element where China might benefit as a convenient alternative in the view of former Soviet states in Central Asia, we could call in that case, as an alternative to Russian influence, particularly as the sanctions on Russia could influence them. And that adds to a question of how would the US respond to these states falling under a greater Chinese sphere of influence. Now, I doubt the United States will want a direct confrontation with China in this area, and I don't think the leaderships will want to take sides in a US-China confrontation, just like they don't want to take sides in the US-Russian confrontation. So the US will have to be careful in its approach. They'll try to limit the collateral damage of economic sanctions on Russia on these countries to the extent they can. But will the United States really rethink its values-led, that is democracy and human rights promotion policy, that leaderships in these countries, particularly in Central Asia and Azerbaijan, would think disturb and threaten their own stability? And could this undercut US relations and influence with these leaderships and cause them to move more towards Russia and China for their own political survival? Now, the Ukrainian invasion should cause a serious rethink of US policy and approaches to the former Soviet republics based on realities and the complexities on the ground, including the generational leadership and identity changes that are going on in these republics, as well as to understand the Russian views and the Chinese views and their activities in this area. However, I would have to say, frankly, I doubt US policymakers are capable of doing a serious rethink because of, frankly, the short-term reactive bureaucratic and political nature of US policymaking processes, and frankly, also a lack of expertise and understanding of the complexities of these societies. Finally, I would just say a lot depends on what happens in Russia too, and the ability of Russia economically and politically to either survive sanctions and military losses and stalemate as the situation evolves in Ukraine. Now, if Russia significantly falters militarily and economically, or suffers internal upheaval or change, the former Soviet states will certainly be watching and will hedge their bets. It could be an opportunity for the United States, just as it could have been when the Soviet Union collapsed, but the consequences are also quite severe for the United States and for the countries in the region, particularly the more authoritarian regimes of these republics. So I'll leave it at that for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator George. And next up, we have Asel Dulat-Geldeva, who's a senior lecturer at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek and has just returned in the past few hours from conducting focus groups fieldwork, where she was assessing, amongst other things, perceptions of the war in Ukraine in Kyrgyzstan. So she's going to speak about the broader perceptions within Central Asia, the effects that the invasion may have on the region. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed, and organizers. I'm glad to be here, part of this panel, and my thoughts go to all the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, there are more victims of Russian imperialism who do not make into international media. And since I was invited to talk about Central Asia, I would like to reflect on this part of the Russian neo-imperialism, what the war means here, and try to decolonize Putin's war. I will start with depicting official responses of Central Asian governments and try to contextualize them because for many in the West, their neutral positions look like as collaboration with Putin or cowardice. Second, I will briefly address what implications the region is already facing and how ordinary people, the poor, are suffering the most from this war. So during the 2nd March special emergency session of the UN Nations General Assembly, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan abstained from condemning Russia's invasion, whereas Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan did not vote at all. So how to understand these positions? Although Uzbekistan did not vote in the beginning, it later took quite an unambiguous anti-war positioning, recognizing the Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty and denying recognition to DPR and LPR. This is a very significant shift from its earlier non-vote and very unusual for the region, which is known for its dependence on Russia. So I think we need to understand this as basically Uzbekistan was never part of the Eurasian Economic Union, neither of the military alliance CSTO, which both are led by Russia. And this gives Uzbekistan much more leverage in taking a much more independent position in this context. The Kazakh government took a neutral position, but offered to be an intermediate platform between the two parties and also sent humanitarian aid. The problem is that in January of this year, Kazakhstani citizens went against the corrupt oligarchic rule in their country in an unprecedented, massive, and bloody uprising since the 30 years of independence. However, this movement was halted by the intervention of Russian-led CSTO troops. And we don't know whether the current authoritarian regime would be still in place if not for this intervention. Second of all, Russian elites have been making similar claims on territorial integrity in northern Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan shares the longest land border with Russia on Earth, and using the Russian ethnic minority to make claims on Russophobia. For example, Putin claimed in September 2014 that Kazakhstan had never been a state prior to 1991, and that Northern Territory was a gift, right? Kyrgyz government proclaimed a neutral position at the UN Assembly, but occupies an ambiguous position by allowing pro-war protests and repressing anti-war protests, and having earlier also stated its understanding to Putin. The context for this answer is that 1/3 of Kyrgyzstani active population works in Russia for decades, and we can effectively call the Kyrgyz state today as a diasporic state because its sovereignty is being shaped by both home society and the vast labor diaspora in Russia. And Putin has been using this large diaspora as a hostage in negotiations in the past. Second of all, Kyrgyzstan has tense relationships with Tajikistan due to the border dispute. And unresolvedness of borders dates to Soviet times, but to the surprise of the many of us, took a militarized form last April. And since then, the skirmishes don't end. Local people believe that behind this amplified aggression on the border stays Russia, for whom it is convenient to keep the region away from cooperation. So as of now, the situation is very tense on the southern border, and ordinary people are preparing for a new round of hostilities. So the Kyrgyz government's cautious positioning has to be read in this context, where official support to Ukraine could be manipulated in tensions with its neighbor Tajikistan. And societies actually in both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan support this neutral status. We don't know how much about Tajik and Turkmen positions outside of their ostensible neutrality, but there is an active regime transition in the states from dictatorship to dynasty, with Turkmenistan succeeding it last week when the president transited power to his son. So in Tajikistan, the rumor is very strong that the same scenario is being in preparation. So the war in Ukraine takes international attention away from these authoritarian developments in the former Soviet Union, and it allows, for example, Rahmon regime to continue repressing resistance in the autonomous Badakhshan region. Tajikistan also claims a threat from Taliban and needs the Russian support to maintain its border security. So we see that not only the global order, but also the regional order is changing, and the Russia's so-called sphere of influence is under change. Regime dynamics are closely interlinked with Putin's future in the coming days and months. In the meantime, we feel, of course, economic implications. They're severe. Central Asian economies have been already weakened by the pandemic. The countries are only now slowly recovering to its pre-pandemic growth. And currently, we're witnessing financial, banking, logistical, and food crises. Inflation has gone up. The prices for basic foods like grain, sugar are also extremely increased. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan GDPs depend on migrant remittances to 30–35%, and many migrants are losing jobs in Russia currently. World Bank predicts already the fall in remittances by 33% for Kyrgyzstan and 20-something% for Tajikistan. I forgot the exact number. And this is very bad because remittances are directly tied to poverty. For Kyrgyzstan, for example, the official numbers show that almost 70% of remittances are spent on food. So the most poor and families will be affected by this war. We also have a growing evidence that Central Asian migrants are being pressured in Russia to conscribe into army in order to fight on the Russian side, being lured and manipulated by prospects of Russian citizenship. There are also other pressures. For example, the Kyrgyzstani tracks with local produce are being blocked inside Russia, which goes against the principles of the Eurasian Union. So, but there are also inside of the societies, there are movements of resistance against Russian politics by civil society. In Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, for example, there are calls to exit Eurasian Union and CSTO. But it's, of course, it's very difficult to jump off so quickly from the Russian economy because these countries are dependent on imports of the most basic stuff like fuel and gas, construction materials, and foodstuffs. So in conclusion, what can be very briefly said, because this is a very dynamic situation and every day it changes, we can see that while Russian authorities are trying to enlist Central Asian migrants to fight on the Russian side, the entire region of the former colonies are getting dragged in the name of their empire. Will this war create chain reactions in the region? We don't know, but we know that societal grievances play a huge role. The pandemic already accentuated inequalities created by oligarchic regimes and led already to a government change in Kyrgyzstan in 2020. And in Kazakhstan, well, not the government change, but at least a huge resistance in Kazakhstan in 2022. So we see that regimes respond to this societal critiques with repressions, and repressions are more likely to continue and even enforce. There might be tightening up of the Russian influence as one big consequence of this war. We already see that the Kremlin is using the term Ukrainization to define and criticize any local language policies, nation building projects, historical revision that signify for local societies the right of self-determination as a pretext to accuse Central Asian states and societies of Russophobia. The decolonizing efforts and movements in the region have been quite weak, if not non-existent. Our revolts, for example, against the authoritarian regimes have been faced with an informational war and delegitimization from Kremlin, distorting our public memories and self-perceptions. So the undoing of Kremlin's influence on self-determination, although de jure happened 30 years ago, but de facto the influence is still there. It's going to take years. That's for the moment, that's it. And I could probably answer some questions about what are the perceptions of society in the region on this war in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Estelle, and thank you to all of the panelists for being very disciplined and staying within the 10-minute limit. That's really good because it gives us some time for Q&A. I see there's one or two questions already coming through, but I just wanted to immediately ask Estelle a question, which is related to pockets of support, levels of support for Russia within Central Asia. I know this is something you've been following. There have been various, as you say, pro-Russia protests in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan as well. What sort of, from what we can understand, what is the level of support? What are the demographic features or reasons, rationales for those groups within society who are supportive of Russia's war in Ukraine?
Oh, so I answer directly, or we collect questions?
I think you can go with that one first, and then.
Oh, okay. Well, it's very difficult to say about the demographics in the absence of quantitative data, right? I've been only able to collect some qualitative data from the focus groups, which I'm running now across Kyrgyzstan, but also observation of social media in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, because that's where I speak and understand local languages. So it's very difficult to say whether the majority of populations support or do not support the war. But my guess from this qualitative data is that I think the majority of Central Asian societies would back the neutrality status. And this backing of neutrality, I think, is really much informed and nurtured by the insecurities that their regimes are imposing and the insecurities that are instilled by the Russian imperialism. So, as I mentioned, Kazakhstan shares the longest border with Russia, and provocations on the Russian side have been very long, for years. And a lot of citizens feel extremely uneasy with what's happening right now, and they ask themselves whether Kazakhstan going to be second in a row after Ukraine, right? And there are, of course, insecurities in Kyrgyzstan related to what's going to happen to a million of migrants and their families who are supported by migrant remittances. So that's why I think it's important for people in Central Asia to keep neutrality as a status which might protect them from getting dragged into the war, but and nevertheless kind of still feel secure. There are, of course, there is, in my sense, also an older generation of people who kind of as if they are really stuck in the Soviet Union. They operate with those with that mentality, and I have impression that they do that. For example, they don't mind to join Russia, not only into the war, but become part of Russia, like Belarus. Because for them, the Soviet Union is associated with much more stability, with much more order, with much more welfare programs, and so on and so forth. So we should probably ask there whether how did this generation went through the 90s, the very painful, traumatic 90s. And I think a lot of people didn't do well in this period. And independence didn't bring them any good, but only hardships. So there is this, I think, generational also element. The younger generation tends to be much more either keeping the neutrality position or pro-Ukrainian. So I think there is this generational split which needs to be further observed. And I think those who support the war a minority, actually. It's once again, difficult to say what are the numbers, but the neutrality status, the neutrality position is a prevalent one.
Thank you for that. And I know that Central Asia Barometer are collecting quantitative data on perceptions of Ukraine. They just finished a survey, so perhaps that will add to our understanding of these dynamics. But turning to US policy, we have a question around how the US or other donors, perhaps the European Union or European countries as well, can help protect Central Asian economies from the sanctions on Russia. Is this on Washington or Brussels' agenda? Are there plans to enact policies to help support Central Asia from the negative effects of sanctioning Russia? That's probably a question for George primarily. And then there's a question which isn't directed at anyone, so anyone can weigh in, about the role of, can we say the role of the poverty the majority of the population in the post-Soviet space plays in favor of Russian authoritarianism? So the role that poverty plays in authoritarianism across the region. So George, I don't know if you want to take that first question.
Like on the matter of, as it were, providing sanctions relief to those countries that are, as I had said in my remarks, could suffer from the collateral damage, economic damage, because of their relationship with, economic relationship with Russia. I haven't seen that there is any movement in the United States government. I'm not in the US government to know what kind of discussions or debates are taking place and what our missions in particularly Central Asia are going back to Washington and saying, I know from experience when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asian Affairs when the Georgian conflict occurred, there was little recognition in Washington at the time of those who developed the sanctions policy against Russia about what the effects would be on friendly countries in the region, such as Kazakhstan, and also American business interests in Central Asia, in my area. So I had to very quickly bring this to the attention to how to work out carve-outs and discussions with these countries of how to alleviate or to have cutouts for them so that they would not fall under the provisions. And we had delegations that then came out to Central Asia to discuss what the meaning of these sanctions and the legislation would be, and what are the kind of things that could be done that they would not suffer from, and to cause a change in a U.S. approach. We also have to consider that at the time, the United States was still actively involved in Afghanistan and the importance of these countries as transit countries for the United States, and not to undermine that and the support for that at the time. We don't have the Afghanistan issue anymore. And I think since and this is speculation, but my own sense is that the sanctions against Russia are so comprehensive and so draconian, covering particularly the SWIFT and the banking area, that is hard to see how countries, particularly those of the Eurasian Economic Union, such as Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, are going to be able to avoid. I think the sense perhaps in Washington is we have to focus on Russia first and foremost, and be willing to accept the collateral damage to others, although with a push that they should do what they can to sever themselves or move beyond their relationship with Russia. With Ukraine, with Kazakhstan, it could be, is this to push or will the Kazakhstanis themselves seek to divert their oil flows, not up through the pipeline that goes through Russia, but to push more oil through barges and like to Azerbaijan, and to have a diversify also their banking system in order to isolate it from the Russian system. Is that possible? I don't know what the appetite it is, since there's this huge absorption in Washington on dealing with Ukraine and Russia, that it will make much of a difference to them what happens in Central Asia. But I would certainly agree it needs to be dealt with. And I would imagine the Central Asian countries that would suffer are probably actively trying to engage Washington and the European Union in how they can not be the ultimate victims. And as I said, there's also this issue of, do they turn to China because the Chinese can offer an alternative? I think there's also a sense in Washington they do not want Russia to use their relationships and in Central Asia and elsewhere as a means of evading the sanctions. And so that's another question that would need to be addressed.
George, and then there's the question of the role that poverty plays in strengthening Russian authoritarianism. And there's also a specific question from Marina. And it's a two-part question. First, from your perspective, could China's wait-and-see policy towards the war be dangerous for the regime itself? How do you view regime stability in the wake of events in Ukraine? And second, why has the official Chinese side chosen the metaphor of fire of war while publicly referring to the current situation? Is this a compromise or a discursive loophole to be used later depending on the overall situation?
Okay, thank you so much for these questions. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a danger from many different ways of taking this wait and see attitude also, because the longer you wait, the more compromised you can also become. And that's of course a danger for China also, that are also already under critique and increasing critique from the West as well. So that's a problem, of course. And then maybe just to tie into what was said about China's role in Central Asia, of course, it opens up opportunities for China even more to have an even stronger economic interest and influence in Central Asia, and also actually also negative influence also when it comes to the political developments in these countries. I don't actually know the metaphor fire war and how it has been used officially in the media. I haven't followed that particular term, so I don't know exactly what that signifies, if anything. So I can't really answer to that second question. But then also Taiwan, of course, is important in this context for China. And also, of course, the reaction from the West that has come because of the war. Again, that is something that the Chinese authorities are also, of course, looking into with respect to Taiwan, although unfortunately, probably the reaction from the West or from Europe wouldn't be as strong because it's farther away. And China is, of course, also more powerful. So economic sanction doesn't really work with China as it potentially works on Russia.
Thank you. And relatedly, and this is maybe one that well, all of the panelists can weigh in on, China's historically portrayed itself as an anti-imperialist force, particularly in its relations with the global South. Does this offer an opportunity to China to strengthen its presence, as George has already alluded to, in places like Central Asia, redirect its efforts in that direction? Or conversely, will we see the opposite, with its lack of condemnation of a Neo-Imperial act and Russia's act of aggression against Ukraine? Will we see the opposite happening and increasing resistance to China's push into regions such as Central Asia? So I don't know if Asel or any of the panelists have thoughts on that.
I can start. I think when it comes to China and Chinese influence in Central Asia, we cannot talk about the region as a homogeneous region, right? And attitudes towards China have been quite varied in the region. So, kind of, I think the political elites on the elite on the level of governments are quite pro-Chinese. And they've been working with China on different projects related to BRI and before the BRI. But when it comes to societies have responded to Chinese presence in the region very differently. So we know, for example, that Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan have been the most anti-Chinese, have been expressing the anti-Chinese sentiments in these past years. We don't see the similar answers in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, but that can be also misleading due simply to the more authoritarian regimes there. Maybe there are such sentiments, but they won't be allowed publicly. But if we now turn to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, anti-Chinese movements, they've been strong in mining areas, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, the extractive industry. A lot of anti-Chinese local movements. People are unhappy with their non-abiding to their environmental laws, for their environmental and human rights abuse. In Kazakhstan, there was a huge land movement in 2016, and people were demanding that Chinese companies cannot occupy land in Kazakhstan for business. But there's also some cultural turn in that, because these people are also against, for example, that Chinese men marry local women. So, and that sentiment, I have to say, also inform the pro-Russianness. For example, when we conduct focus groups in Kyrgyzstan, people say that they view Russia as a guarantor of security, as a protector in the region. And when we ask, protect against whom or what? What is the threat in the region? Well, they say China. That China might grab land, as it already did in Kyrgyzstan, and they also refer to Tajikistan. So that China is perceived as a threat. And that's why the pro-Russianness is indirectly related to this anti-Chinese sentiments and also anti-Western sentiments as well, because America have committed quite a lot of failures in the region, which it could actually avoid. So I think this decoupling will not be that easy. So the arrival of China to replace Russia, I think, is much more problematic. Maybe it can replace Russia for economic things like imports, but politically, culturally, historically, socially, I think it's much more complicated.
Did any of the other panelists have opinions on how China's role is going to be affected by Ukraine?
I would just like to say that I support what Asel had said. When I was ambassador in Kazakhstan and in Uzbekistan, you know, the sense, particularly when I was out in the countryside, I would get a different story speaking to governmental people, which would be our relationship with China is friendly, etc. But this deep abiding sense of fear, almost racial fear of China, of overwhelming them and marrying their women and things of this nature, and also that their only form of support can be ultimately from Russia as the large. I heard that frequently in speaking to them. I also, in my contacts with Chinese diplomats and others in the region, it was very interesting to see the change in Chinese diplomacy and in the attitudes of their diplomats who used to be very quiet, not very vocal about China's role and the like, changing towards the end. I left in 2018 to becoming very vocal about the power of China, and also with almost an edge of contempt towards the influence and power of the Russian Federation, which I thought was quite amazing, even in public venues, where Chinese diplomats would say things like, everyone should realize that one province in China alone has a greater GDP than the entire Russian Federation. What is interesting, and it could be for another discussion, is the conflict or collision of the Russian imperial idea, which we talked about earlier, with the Chinese imperial idea itself. And I think I could see in China that just as Vladimir Putin has looked, it's not the Soviet Union, it's the imperial idea of Russia as the unifier, as having this cultural, almost religious mission, going back more to Nicholas I than to Lenin or Stalin, that Xi Jinping and China is also looking to pass the history of the great Chinese imperial project, which you even see in writings of Chinese historians and publicists about what is the Russian Far East as being part of China and the like. How this will develop, is there going to be a clash of these imperial ideas, which of course directly comes together when the tectonic plates move in Central Asia, is something I think we should be watching intently.
Marina?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. I think these were excellent comments from Aysel and George. And for the rest of the global south and Africa and Latin America, we haven't heard so much about their reactions either, and I haven't followed it very closely. So I don't see that having such an immediate impact on them and the relations with China, which is also problematic. I mean, in Africa, and there's also anti-Chinese sentiments. And Chinese investments that create problems or resentment. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And then there's a final question in the chat related to Russia, I think yesterday, ending the exemption on Kazakhstan exporting oil to the United States via the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, and whether that is another example of Russia trying to put pressure on Kazakhstan to take a more supportive stance of its efforts in Ukraine. So I don't know if anyone saw that news or cared to comment on that specific aspect. Okay, George, please.
I would say that yes, it would be highly damaging to Kazakhstan, but it would seem that since this is one of the largest, the oil producing out of the Tengiz field and Karachaganak that fills much of the coffers of, for instance, the global energy companies of Chevron, ExxonMobil, other partners in the consortium and the like. Is this really a Russian reaction to punish the Western ones, and that in this case is Kazakhstan the collateral damage? Will Kazakhstan, has there been discussions between Russia and Kazakhstan? As I know, in Kazakhstan, the president has set up a special commission to look at the effects and deal with it. And will this create a common cause for cross-Caspian shipments through Azerbaijan? But then again, will Azerbaijan come under pressure from Russia if seen as facilitating this workaround? But maybe it's something that the Russian Federation would accept, but it remains to be seen. But I think this is a very significant decision, and it would be interesting to know what is the Kazakhstani government reaction to doing about it. Were they forewarned, and are there sort of ways they can work around it? Because this is clearly the biggest budget item of their revenues comes from those fields and that pipeline.
Thank you, George, and thank you to all of the panelists on what was an interesting discussion on the broader impact of the war in Ukraine on the region. And so Elena Podolian, who was supposed to be chairing the third panel, which is starting now, is unfortunately having internet connectivity issues. So I will step in and moderate our final panel of today, where we will be refocusing, I think, on Russia and Ukraine specifically. And so first, we will hear from Dr. Andreas Åland, who's an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and also an associate professor of political science at the National University of Kiev Mohyla Academy. So Andreas, like other panelists, you have 10 minutes for some opening remarks, so we leave plenty of time for the Q&A. Over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot. My presentation will perhaps be a good addition to what Greg Yudin has been talking about earlier. My reference here is also partly perhaps a book that Greg has been also using by Stephen Hansen, Post-Imperial Democracies, where Hansen compares Bonapartism, France and Weimar Germany and post-Soviet Russia. And I want to maybe first say here something about the general development of Russian imperialism recently, and then the distinction between what I would call revolutionary and reactionary or restorationist imperialism. So what we are now observing is basically a rapprochement between the sort of extra-systemic or oppositionist, you could even say, post-Soviet Russian neo-imperialism, pronounced most vividly and most scandalously by such people as Vladimir Zhirinovsky or Alexander Dugin and others, and the official position of the Russian government and the Russian president. So what we've been seeing here is an approximation in terms of the three, I would see them, basic positions of Russian imperialism, that is namely rather Slavophile position in the classical Russian quarrel between Westernizers and Slavophiles, which is very much about the relationship between of Russia to the West. Typically, most of the Russian thinkers, even the more isolationist, the more anti-Western, take, in spite of their anti-Westernism, an ambivalent position on that. So, for instance, if you take Alexander Dugin, he has been very much, of course, an anti-Westernist, but in fact, if you look on the genesis of his ideas, they have been very much inspired by Western or geographically Western, one should say, not so much ideologically Western, geographically Western thinkers, like, for instance, from the Conservative Revolution, from the Nouvelle Droite, the New French Right, traditionalism, and so on. Something similar could be said about Zhirinovsky, who has been more focused on the South, actually, than on the West, and has actually even proposed some sort of alliance between Russia and the West against the South. And something similar is there with the Putinist regime that is now also in this spectrum of Slavophiles versus Westernizers, presenting itself as being certainly on the sort of Russian nationalist position, but also as presenting itself as sort of the classical Europe, as the defender of European values, and thereby also being, in a strange sense, Westernizing. The second approximation that has happened recently and has arguably perhaps started obviously in 2005 with the already mentioned quote from Putin, where he regrets the downfall of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, is the single stream theory. The single stream theory says that the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Empire, and the post-Soviet Russian state are, in spite of the enormous disruptions in their emergence, and also the enormous differences in their sort of systemic structure and ideological justification, the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Empire, and the post-Soviet Russian state, in fact, belong to a single stream of history. They continue Russian history in a continuous way, because you can sort of sometimes deeply hidden some sort of generic features in all of these different states, in spite of the Bolsheviks having been anti-Tsarist, the post-Soviet Russian regime having emerged in opposition to the Soviet regime. So they all belong to a single stream. And that is, of course, a classical position also, for instance, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, that has, in spite of its name, also taken this sort of single stream theoretical historical interpretation. And the third feature that is now also more and more emerging is the idea that the Russian nation is not actually a nation, but it represents either by itself a civilization, or it represents the core of a larger civilization that is sometimes called an Orthodox civilization, or a Eurasian civilization, or in some other way. And here we now also see this emerging, in that we have now a so-called Eurasian Economic Union. Putin just now, especially in the recent weeks, he speaks, and also other representatives of the Russian state, simply of the West, Zapad. He doesn't make as many as he used to do earlier distinctions between, let's say, Europe or Western Europe and North America, or between different European states. But the enemy clearly is now the West. And the enemies are also now the people in Russia that somehow are linked to the West, or are seen as speakers of the West. And so, and this is also, of course, a typical feature of Russian imperialism, that is actually, you know, the main justification for Russian imperialism, in that Russia, the Russian nation, is not actually just a nation, and Russia should not just have a nation state. It needs to be an empire. And people like Dugin, they have said that Russia will either be an empire or it will not exist, actually. Maybe Putin and his his entourage are not as far that in this, but they have gone far in this direction, especially in the last month, but also already before. And that may create the impression that because of this rapprochement between such people as Zhirinovsky, Dugin, and Putin, what we are now observing is a fascistization of the Russian regime, and the kind of warfare that Russia conducts in Ukraine and has been already earlier conducting in Chechnya or in Syria, also sort of suggestive in this direction. However, I would still argue that the kind of imperialism that has now become mainstream in Russia is still needs to be still distinguished from the revolutionary, as I would call, imperialism of people like Dugin and Zhirinovsky, who are driven by slightly different, or at least the Zhirinovsky of the 1990s. Maybe Zhirinovsky in the recent years, I have not followed him as closely as I used to in the 1990s, but at least the Zhirinovsky of 1990, they want a new empire. So Zhirinovsky, for instance, I'll finish in a second. Zhirinovsky in the 1990s proposed, as you may have then read, a so-called last dash to the south, an extension of Russia beyond not only the borders of the Russian Federation, but also beyond the borders of the former Tsarist Empire and the former Soviet Union, by way of including into the Russian Empire Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan, quite explicitly. This is now in recent years he has not repeated that with such explicitness, but he was basically saying that Russia needs to be saved and the world needs to be saved by a new imperial expansion of Russia that would not just restore the Tsarist or Soviet Empire, but actually go beyond that. And somewhat similar and more elusively, Dugin has also spoken in these terms in his sort of fluid definition of a Eurasian empire that would go from Dublin to Vladivostok, something like that, and clearly also proposing a Russian imperial vision that goes way beyond the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Empire. I think Putin is not there, or maybe one should say is not yet there, although I would still argue that he will also probably not go there. What he wants to restore is basically the Tsarist Soviet Empire in some way, partly, and to reconquer territories that have been lost, mainly perhaps those territories that once belonged to the Soviet Empire. That does not have to be a military conquest. It can also be some other scheme. Maybe it now excludes actually the 3 Baltic republics, but this is a kind of imperialism that I think needs to be still distinguished from the more revolutionary, one could argue fascist imperialism of people like Dugin, Zhirinovsky, and others. And that is, I think, worth mentioning because it also has policy implications. I think conservative or ultra-conservative restorationist reactionary imperialism is simply another kind of political animal than a fascist or revolutionary imperialism. That is, I would say, although we sometimes now getting doubts about this, a leadership that is still calculating, that is still in a framework, in a basically conservative framework, where costs and risks are set against gains and successes, and that is also why I think such measures as weapons deliveries and for Ukraine and sanctions against Russia do make sense. Whereas some people argue that doesn't make sense because Putin is now on a sort of irrational, perhaps even suicidal trip, similar to those of, let's say, Hitler, where nothing actually will impress him, and you should either surrender or basically kill him, something like that. And there's nothing in between. I don't think that we are there. I don't think actually Putin belongs to this type of political phenomena. There is still to be something to be done, and we should not let ourselves be too much impressed when Putin plays with World War III, with the nuclear threat, and so on. I think that is calculated. That is not something that is coming here from a revolutionary imperialist, from a fascist who would go as far as he can in such a confrontation. So maybe I stop at this. It's a very sort of complicated, I would argue, as I see it, area, and also very contentious area. In Ukraine, for instance, many think actually that Putin is a fascist, and that's it. And there are also scholars who think already in these terms, but I would still make these distinctions, although I do see the approximation between revolutionary imperialism and reactionary or restorationist imperialism of Putin's regime.
Thank you, Andres. Already seen some questions in the Q&A for you, so keep those coming. We'll come to those at the end after two more presentations, our final two presentations. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Ingerid Opdahl, who's an associate professor at the Institute for Defense Studies and Norwegian Defense University College. She'll talk about authoritarianism, Russian foreign policy, and questions of agency.
Well, thank you. Yes, the starting point was for this talk was a very simple question, because there was a need to try to make sense in the understanding the meaning of the term, as in making possible an analysis in the face of senseless war, and I felt a need to apply some familiar concepts. So I asked some questions of agency. So when faced with a military invasion that was so clearly the results of one man's or a few men's decisions and dispositions, is it possible to analyze it as anything else than a product of individual agency? And how can we understand the structures that are bound to be there that enable this development, and how can we see the agents as mutually constituting each other in foreign policy analysis terms? So this is a revisit of the actor structure interaction in a personal effort to make sense. And at this point, it might be more about asking questions than bringing new knowledge to the table. So only agency made it into the title, but it's really about both agency and social structure. So I'll first very briefly restate the actor structure issue as seen from foreign policy analysis, and then look into actor structure questions to approach the invasion. Now, as you all know, the agency structure or actor structure issue is how we can understand the relationship between actors and social structures, and when this is approached as a problem, whether individual behavior is shaped by social structures or by human agency. Now, over recent decades, there's been a lot of contributions in standing on various theoretical backgrounds on how this is also an issue of understanding the relationship between actors and social structures as they mutually constitute each other. So actors are shaped by and act within structures, simultaneously reproducing and changing them. And for foreign policy analysis, I would follow Walter Carlsness' seminal article from 1992, in that agents produce and reproduce while also being determined by international and domestic social structures. Just a few brief remarks that it's important to think of actors here as strategic. So when they act, they seek to attain a goal further on. But they also have a view to how the structures could change because of their actions, enabling future actions or changing the constraints for the future. So this is not to be understood in a deterministic way, but in the sense of opening avenues of action. A second remark, structures are constraints and enablers for actors, but some actors are constrained and enabled more than others. So this is actors are unequal. And when it comes to individuals, actors and actions, perceptions matter, how structures are perceived by the actors to constrain and enable. So now on to the second part, how ideas about actors in domestic and international social structures can help us analyze what has happened or some of the things going on. My perspective is, of course, mainly on Russia as an invading state and the primary decision maker being Vladimir Putin. Who the actor is as a person, also if we take into consideration that there is a very small group of people around Putin who are actively involved in policymaking. So this is fairly obvious, but there is a need to ask questions about this actor or group of actors. What are their perceptions, ideas, information, especially of the about the constraints and enabling structure they act within and upon, and when it comes to how they relate to structures, how do their actions relate to the structures that are both domestic and international. So that means that I would like to systematize my answers into one discussion of perceptions, a couple of perceptions that are significant, and there's also the question of the domestic structures and the international structures. There is one perception on nationalism as neo-imperialism, and of course this is unlike with Andreas Åland, the preceding speaker, this is not my field of expertise, but just to make it clear, my views about what it means to be Russian, about Russian and Ukrainian peoples being parts of one whole as seen by Putin. In my view, this can be seen as connected to a prevailing myth of the positive experience of the multinational and multicultural Soviet Union, and in the broader sense to a lack of critique of the past, discussion of the past, critically informed debate in the public sphere in Russia. And together with ambitions of restoring Russia's position as a great power, this constitutes a neo-imperialist project. Now, there are certainly other sides to it, but the point here is this matters also structurally insofar as part of the ideas about the limits of Russianness and unity of Ukrainians and Russian resonate with parts of Russian society, thanks also to propaganda. And perhaps particularly so with the parts of society in which Putin has sought support and legitimization in the third and fourth periods of his presidency. So as seen from the autocrat's point of view, the domestic structures support these ideas. And then this is taken into the international structures by way of invasion. But there are also other domestic structures that enable a personalist authoritarian leader. The permissiveness of a personalist authoritarian regime where concentrated personal power combines with distorted flows of information upwards in the system, including on issues relevant to the use of, for example, military power. So the authoritarian leader is thus not necessarily well informed, but he is in a position where he perceives to be well informed due simply to his power. And there are very few constraining structures. So this is a domestic social structure that enables authoritarian leaders, particularly personalist autocrats, to make policy moves, including making decisions on starting a war. Now, in a position as an autocrat, there is another significant perception of Russia as a great power. So here I would emphasize that in Russia's prevailing Russian thinking on world order, great powers have rights to a sphere of influence where they have a prerogative to act as a hegemon if necessary, and the necessity here is then built on perceptions of national interest in the great power itself. Now, in 2008 and to some extent in 2014, international structures such as international law were used as justification for military aggression in a way that's represented a distortion and undermining of the same structures of international law. But now, this year, the perception seems to be that international law is irrelevant, and that to me is a major change. So in this sense, the perception of what constitutes Russian great powerness is even narrower, more restricted than before. So all domestic and also some international social structures are then intentionally sought to be instrumentalized to expand Russia's reach, both spatially in terms of status as a great power. So from this perspective, you could argue that this is a totalitarian project, not necessarily in the end a successful one. But there's the instrumentalization is that apart from supporting Russia's great power position, very little else matters. And then on to some more open questions on the connection between domestic and international structures. Because there is a question I sort of want to work further on. What of the relation then between the domestic social structures and international ones? Because put simply, there is a relation between repression and increasing personalization of the Russian regime at home and the invasion of Ukraine, but how to approach the relationship. Now, it seems part of one project, which is a totalitarian at home and war abroad. But to what extent were domestic repression and personalization part of preparing and planning for war? There has also been a tightening of screws in consequence of the invasion and war. So the strategic actor or actors at the top of the regime have acted with respect to domestic and international social structures at the same time in very closely connected ways. And to me, it seems that to a considerable extent, the invasion of Putin and the actors around him are in a lack of separation between the domestic and the international. So this is not just in the sense of people's perceptions about Russian and Ukrainian peoples being parts of one whole and expanding the reach of Russia, but that it goes both ways. So war and invasion with Ukraine is also war within Russian society, because the project that includes war and a total instrumentalization of social structures extends inwards as well as outwards. So going on and trying to see how this can bring our analysis further and perhaps eventually contribute something other than questions. It is very pertinent, I think, to look at how war and the invasion and what will come ahead also is used domestically, not just because that is of interest in itself, because it's going to be very important, but also because the questions that are raised about the future of the regime and the future of where this will take Russia will have effects both in domestic and social international structures. So I leave it at that with some very open and perhaps very loosely organized thoughts. But I think that is something that will be more and more relevant going ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you. There were some interesting links between your remarks and Andreas's on foreign policy making process that we can hopefully pick up in the Q&A. But our final panelist, our final speaker of today is Dr. Ilmari Kaiho, who is an associate professor of war studies at the Swedish Defence University and a veteran of the Finnish Defence Forces. He's going to speak about strategy in the war in Ukraine.
Thank you for having me, and I'm also a researcher at the CBES at the Sätre University. So what I thought to do with my 10 minutes is to just present you a sort of 10-minute observation or summary of observations from the war so far. There's of course two caveats immediately. One is that there's much that we don't know what is happening. And this is an interesting war in the sense that we often get much of our information from the Ukrainian side. From the start, most of these videos and pictures, photos published online, they have come from Ukrainian sources, and we haven't really seen an equivalent of sources from the Russian side. So we probably have a bit biased source of information so far, at least. And the second caveat is, of course, that we might be after a month into the war, we might be in its early stages. The war has already changed quite a bit. And it will definitely continue to change depending on what happens on the ground and what happens on the international side as well. That said, there are some things that we have already been able to observe, and perhaps the two most important things are that we have greatly overestimated the Russian military capability, and also greatly underestimated the Ukrainian military capability, and perhaps more importantly, the Ukrainian will to resist. From Russian side, this underestimation of the Ukrainian military capability and the Ukrainian will to resist, that has been a grave political miscalculation. So it's likely, how it looks like, is that Russia went into the war, which they don't call a war, of course. And this is perhaps not only an euphemism, but this kind of military campaign, it might also be how they perceived this war from the beginning, that it wouldn't be actually war, it would be a repeat of the Crimean scenario in 2014, just on a national scale. And that operation Russians probably didn't understand as a war, hence they thought that this might be something similar, not call it a war. So it might not only be an euphemism here. Of course, this kind of understanding that this was possible is completely perplexing, because it seems to miss what has happened in Ukraine during the past 8 years since Crimea. And since War of Donbass. Ukraine has done military reforms for 8 years, and also this war that Putin started in 2014, it has greatly changed the Ukrainian society, and this kind of will to resist has only grown. We can of course talk about, and this is something probably for historians in the future, why this kind of miscalculation, why did it happen? There have been different explanations ranging from FSB polls done before the war, which showed that 40% of Ukrainians would not, for instance, defend Ukraine. Well, if you turn it around, 60% of will defend your country is not that unusual in European countries either. There's also a possibility that Putin actually believes in this kind of unity between Ukrainians and Russians. There is also a possibility that this war was decided by a very small number of key decision makers. I've heard numbers ranging from 2 to 12, and as I would assume that these people are not critical thinkers, but rather yes men. But the key consequence for the war in Ukraine was that in its early stages, the Russian forces they use very limited force. So there was an estimation that it was perhaps 20-25% of all these forces that Russia had gathered around Ukrainian borders during the months before and the year before. And this was a very small force, even in comparison to the Ukrainian military. We also saw Russians bypassing cities. So it was actually only Kiev that they really tried to take in the early days of the war. And we had these very small attacks with special forces and so on, which are completely insufficient for the task. We also saw the selection of targets, because Russians, they only well, perhaps not only, but mostly targeted military installations in the beginning and military targets. So there were accidents, of course, which always happen. But they didn't, for instance, attack political targets in Kiev, which again suggests that they could just come, they could take Kiev, change the government to a Russian-friendly one, and then leave without occupying Ukraine. And of course, the main point here is that this kind of Russian force that Russia still has in the country, now after putting probably all of these forces that were gathered around Ukrainian borders, even this force is woefully insufficient in an occupation. Russia does not have resources for this, as it looks right like now. Another thing that we didn't see was a shock and awe kind of attack in the early days of war, like in Iraq war in 2003. And perhaps what has become one of the biggest Russian mistakes is that they didn't really put much effort into establishing control of air. So it's still contested as we speak, which is very perplexing again. This was the first thing that analysts, including myself, thought that Russia would do. They didn't. Of course, one explanation here is that they simply don't have the capability to do so, which then would suggest that the Russian military is indeed very bad. Then we have, of course, heard about logistical problems. We have heard about moral problems, perhaps connected to poor preparation. It sounds like not all soldiers that Russia sent knew that they were, or what they were doing. There's also been discussion about use of minorities who might not be very motivated in fighting these kinds of wars. Worth to point out here is also that all these discussions during the past decade about Russian cyber information capabilities, we haven't seen pretty much any of these being used. On the information sphere, they lost out to Ukrainians pretty much immediately. In the Western world, this has to be emphasized. Hybrid things we haven't really seen. And perhaps Bettina Renz and other scholars have been right all along here about Russian military capabilities, but also that the Russian military is still a very conventional military, and that it's not this military that can fight wars in a different way by combining military and non-military means and ways. Of course, then the final thing is that the war is a dynamic, really, that it doesn't really mean that the Ukrainian military has to be very good. It just needs to be good enough against the Russian military. And this is how it looks like. But I think both Russian and Western observers, we had missed these Ukrainian military reforms during the 8 years. And many of us didn't really believe that the Ukrainian military would hold. What, however, is perhaps more consequential for the war is that the Ukrainian will to defend, that was also underestimated. And of course, this kind of will to defend, it's not a new phenomenon. So already in 2014, we saw in the war in Donbass that the Ukrainians mobilized to defend against the Russian-supported separatists. And this is something that, of course, has become countrywide phenomenon now. So if in 2014 we can speak about spirit of 2014, I think what we have seen a month ago and what we see increasingly today is spirit of 2022. 2014, this was a limited phenomenon. Now it is a countrywide, nationwide phenomenon. But again, to be emphasized, it's not a new thing. This actually happened just weeks after the capture of Crimea. So perhaps Russian military planners looked at the Crimea operation, but then missed what happened in Donbass. And actually what turned out in Donbass was that the Ukrainian military and the voluntary battalions, they were able to push out, or they were close to pushing out the separatists. And then Russians had to intervene with the regular military forces to save the day. And that's how we got the People's Republics. what kind of forms has then the Ukrainian defense received or had? As noted, they are much more capable militarily than many of us believed. And also they have been apparently able to inflict quite serious casualties on Russians, and not least on their logistic chains. And of course, wars cannot be really being fought without logistics, and modern wars, of course, require ammunition, gasoline, and food, and all kinds of things. And perhaps the worst example of how Russians have struggled with this is the 60-kilometer long convoy that was stuck in north of Kiev, or northwest of Kiev, just some time ago. And this has been perhaps not catastrophic, but it has been very consequential for the Russian war effort, which now appears to have stalled down. So in the north, in the south, we don't see much action or many successful offensives from the Russian side. We are starting to see Ukrainian counteroffensives, which is of course bad news for Russians. Then again, perhaps the fighting is shifting to the southeast, into the Mariupol region. And there, of course, it looks now that Mariupol will fall within days or perhaps within a week or two. Because there's simply not enough Ukrainian reinforcements close enough to change that situation. And perhaps Mariupol is a good example here in the sense that after the initial Russian plans were frustrated by the Ukrainian defense, then they changed the targets, they changed the strategy very soon. So actually one of perhaps two alternatives here. The first one was to go into negotiating table, find a honorable way out if that was possible. Cut short one's losses. The second one was then to intensify violence, and of course we have seen that it's the second alternative that Russians chose. Perhaps here Mariupol has been used as a sort of an example. This is what happens to all Ukrainian cities if you don't give up, and the devastation there is quite heavy. And of course, this is something that we probably will see more in the future if and when the war continues. At the same time, perhaps if optimistically one can think that Mariupol would give Putin a way out from the situation by establishing the land corridor to Crimea and then some sort of victory. We defended the People's Republics, we established a land bridge and we won. But this is of course optimistic thinking. We might see very drastic escalation of war. Now there have been intelligence reports from the US about chemical and biological weapons. Here, perhaps we shouldn't we shouldn't perhaps think that these are likely scenarios, but at the same time, one should remember that many of the US intelligence estimations before the war were actually correct. Also, there's a bit of a problem about discussing these kinds of weapons of mass destruction, because this is of course what Putin wants. He wants to spread terror, and this is sort of why we shouldn't perhaps talk about this too much. I think I should stop here, and then we'll take the rest in the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that very concise overview of Russian strategy, its failings, and the performance of the Ukrainian military. So as I said, we have a few questions in the chat. First one is related to Zhirinovsky. Again, I think this is directed probably more towards Andreas. What is he still relevant? How do we evaluate the impact of these nationalist thinkers, Dugin, Zhirinovsky, the impact of Eurasianism on foreign policy decision making, discussed by Ingerid. And the second part of the question, well, actually a question from a different participant, related to the differences between white Russian nationalism and red Soviet imperial nationalism. Are the two now merged within Ukrainian nationalist imperial discourses? How are they interacting? So I think we'll start with Andreas.
Yes, I'm actually grateful for this question, because it explains a little bit something I may have forgotten to say, is that there is actually something to be discussed here, in that what we've recently heard from Putin and from other leading representatives of the ruling regime, and also what we've seen now in action, appears very much as a sort of implementation of things that people like Dugin and Zhirinovsky and others have been saying already in the 1990s. So if you take, for instance, maybe the seminal work of post-Soviet Russian fascism, the book Osnovy Geopolitiki, Foundations of Geopolitics of Dugin, he is basically describing in words similar to those of Putin why there should be no Ukrainian state, that the Black Sea shore of Ukraine should be under Russian control, that the large parts of Ukraine should become Russian, and so there is actually something to be discussed here. And or with Zhirinovsky, perhaps the biggest coincidence here is simply the use of the Russian army for imperial expansion. You know, that was very much sort of Zhirinovsky's argument here, that we have a this is the way of that the way Russia has always existed. It has an army, and the army should expand the territory, and that is just what Russia is about. He was more focused on the south, and he had this sort of whole sort of special thing about the so-called Eurasian, and that the south should be soothed, which was very much about sort of a racist, anti-Muslim argument. But the soothing idea, that's there's something in the neighborhood where there were sort of these unstable people. When Putin talks about Zelensky as a drug addict, when he talks about denazification, you have these crazy extremist, unstable people in the neighborhood, and they need some soothing. Uspokojenie is the main term that Zhirinovsky uses. He to be sure, he doesn't use them in the last dash to the south with regard to Ukraine. He uses them with regard to Central Asia, to Turks, to Caucasians, to Muslim people. But the soothing idea that you need a large imperial power that needs to take care of all these small crazy people, that is also something that we have now in Putin's rhetoric. So that is a certain approximation between these discourses. I'm still not sure how much actually there was a direct influence of people like Dugin or Zhirinovsky on Putin. I think perhaps not directly, but not only Dugin and Zhirinovsky, but also others like Prokhanov and Glaziev and Baburin and many others, in fact, have shaped the post-Soviet Russian discourse. And they have, I think, shaped it to a larger degree than we have often recognized. We've read other authors, of course, because there have been also many interesting liberal authors and or sort of more playful authors like what's his name, Surkov, or we haven't paid much attention to these sort of crazy neo-imperial types, but they have been very present, and I think they have prepared the ground and they have shaped the discourse. And my impression is that Putin is also expressing here something. I think that was also something that came out in Ingerid's, if I've understood her correctly, presentation, that this is not something that is only coming from Putin, but it's expressing larger trends. And these larger trends have, I think, been influenced to a stronger degree than we have noticed the general discourse. And that was actually visible already in the opinion polls for many years, that you had this growing anti-Westernism and anti-Americanism, especially among the elites. And now this has basically become the social potential has now become real foreign policy.
Thank you. Ingrid?
Yes, yes. If I can just add on to that, because I really agree with what you say, Andreas, and in many ways I think that, at least from my perspective, one of the things that perhaps is going on here is that if you want to restore or improve or augment Russia's position as a great power, you have to find support in the prevailing ideas that are there in the discourse. So I mean, of course, there's a good reasons to believe that this is something that Putin and people around him might actually believe, but in any way, the way that this have sort of entered also their ideas and language and their world is by contact with the foreign policy thinkers that they have actually interacted with or read or sought when trying to develop also their thinking. So I think just in very ordinary authoritarian exchange of ideas, this is you sort of search. I should think from perspective of the autocrat, you search for support with the groups in society that can offer something that can actually act as the basis for your desired policies. So there might be a bit of going back and forth, and at some point this is merged. Yeah. So I think we have to be open for that.
There's another question on ideology, but I'll come back to that in a moment because there are a few questions for Ilmari as well. The first is, could you speak a little bit more about the aspect of terror, which you touched upon briefly right before the end of your presentation? And then Elena, whose internet connection is not stable enough for her to moderate, but luckily she's managing to use the chat function, is following up and asking about Mariupol, and the siege on Mariupol being a demonstrative act of terror. But the other day there have been statistics that 90% of strikes have hit civilian, not military infrastructure. Can such a strategy of terror be successful militarily, not politically? So the role of terror in Russia's military strategy and whether it can be effective.
It is an excellent question, and like I said, after the frustration of the military strategy, just focusing on the military forces of Ukraine in the early days of the war, when that was frustrated by the resistance, then Russians apparently made the decision to start focusing even on civilian targets. This might also have to do with the poor Russian military capability, because it's much easier to shoot the artillery into a city where civilians get killed as a result more than defenders. Than to actually engage in pure fighting. But I think when it comes to terror, we have two different levels here. One in Ukraine, and this is perhaps best exemplified by Mariupol. Here, one could assume that it is about demonstrative terror, like Olena says. And the question is, when you try to break resistance through this kind of terror by attacking on civilians, what you essentially do is that you raise the costs for the opponent, and essentially you raise the cost for the people themselves in places like Mariupol, but you also raise it for the Ukrainian political leadership. When do they start to feel that this is enough and they need to sue for peace? We haven't seen this yet, and this use of terror, it can go both ways. It can break resistance, but it can also galvanize resistance. And in this sense, I think Mariupol is an interesting example because they have not given up. Even though the situation now looks pretty hopeless, they have not given up, and this is important. Also, like Olena says, there's a political cost with this kind of strategy because it does make you look like a barbarian when you do use these kinds of tactics, and that's not necessarily a good strategy on the long run. It might also be a non-efficient strategy. The second level, really, just quickly, it's about the nuclear card that Putin has showed already at the start of the war. And basically he said that if Western countries, other parties intervene, then nuclear weapons are on the table. And this has then meant that the Western response has been muted. Or direct military response of the West has been muted. Of course, what we see in the West is that there is a massive assistance given to Ukraine to bolster Ukrainian defense, and of course, it's not enough for Ukraine to have a will to defend, but they also need to have the means to defend, and this is something that we have provided. But even here, there's a political cost in showing this nuclear card, and not least using these kinds of weapons of mass destruction. This would be huge. This would be huge, and I do suppose that even in Russia, the threshold to do this is very high. I hope so. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you for that. And so, coming back to the question of ideologies, we have a question related for Ingerid and Andreas about whether Putin's behavior, Putin's ideas are nurtured by an ideology, or are we witnessing a new form of pragmatic, non-ideological fascism? So what role does ideology specifically play in Russia's behavior, Russia's worldview?
Well, I think I've spoken already about this. I think that's the ideology of the restoration of the empire, which is a very common phenomenon. In fact, for those who have studied these sort of post-imperial situations, there's actually very little surprise in here. In a way, you could argue what was really surprising in post-Soviet Ukrainian history, that there was no war with Russia until 2014. Although there had been war in Moldova, in Georgia, in Chechnya, and so on, and Belarus and Armenia had been taken under control. There was the Armenian-Azeri war. So, and Ukraine survived until 2014 without war. I have actually a separate paper on that where I explain, why that was the case, namely because Russia was dependent on the Ukrainian gas transportation system until Nord Stream 2 went online. So what needs to be explained here is not so much the ideology. I think the ideology is pretty clear and that is something very common, but rather why it has now played itself out in this way. And yeah, I mean, it's in a way the Putin's ideology is very Russian, but then it's also very common for these sort of post-imperial situations. There was, in fact, in the early 1990s, if you remember, some of those who are old enough to have already read at this time sort of foreign policy text, there was a discussion when John Mersheimer published an article where he argued that Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons because, in the sort of post-imperial situation, you would have the old empire coming back, and then there was a response to that from others, and then it went on actually through in several iterations this debate. And the interesting thing about this debate was that there was no expert on Eastern Europe participating in it. It was just IR scholars who saw clearly that this is an explosive situation. You have this sort of empire falling apart, and then you have these former Soviet republics, and that this is going to blow up sooner or later. That was clear to these people who have not studied. Mersheimer and Huntington, I think, was another one, and then the editor, I can't remember, of International Security, who was participating in this. But none of them actually, I think none of them was actually even a Russian reader, not to speak of Ukrainian language readers. And they already knew that this was coming. And so the ideology here is simply something that we've seen already earlier, and that has now just become more explicit than it was there already before. And as I said, it's all the old stories about Russia as a civilization, the single stream theory, the Slavophile westernizers controversy. These are all old features of Russian political thought.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. Yes, as I come back to your remark, Andreas, on there being many ideas about Russia, and then perhaps we have overlooked the impact of that some of the ideas we're already having, because there were so many ideas, and others were both more appealing and more interesting in a way. If that's, yeah, that's at least some of my own thoughts on that account, and both in terms of what has happened, sort of if you think about the policies that are involved or have been involved in relationship with Ukraine, and the ideas about what it means, what Russia, what role Russia has in the region, and also in relation to Ukraine. Once you, that's at least my experience, is that once you start trying to go back, and where was there a turn? What are the sources? So much of this has a heritage that actually goes back to the 90s, and sometimes the rather early 90s. But then with the increasing authoritarianism in the Russian political system, and the closing off of entire topics from public discussion, or even in some cases elite discussion, and especially with the increase in personal power around Putin, it's this increasingly, this has also been more and more of a one-dimensional stream or discourse of ideas, but in ways that it hasn't always been so easy to appreciate. But the sources of this go way back, and in many ways it's only well, it's very recent, a couple of years since I had a discussion with another scholar, and on how surprising it was and fortunate that there hadn't been more violence and hadn't been more war going on in the long dissolution of the Soviet Union. So it's something that it's a bit difficult to, well, it's a bit, it brings today into perspective, because it's sometimes that is an interesting idea, but of course there was a war already going on.
Wonderful, thank you for that, and thank you to all of our panelists across the three panels this morning, over here in the United States, this afternoon in Europe. So with that, we will close, and thank everyone for participating as an audience member, as a panelist, for your questions and for your discussion on this important topic. I hope we'll have an opportunity to engage again on these issues. So wish everyone a good rest of your day, and continued solidarity with the people of Ukraine in these very trying times.